on today's episode of Retrial Podcast.
When Herb was representing the plaintiff, and then he would ask questions of one witness like, well, what is Alice's reputation among all those peons down in the trash alley? What do they think of her? Or the extreme cruelty, it would be, well, now, we got to have something good here. It's not just cruelty that's aground. It's extreme cruelty. We want some extreme cruelty here. Or not just a neglect of duty, but gross neglect of duty.
What's good, everyone? Welcome to Retrial Podcast, where we basically decode legal history in Dayton, Ohio, the Gem City, right? These cases, lawyers, and stories set the stage for present-day learning across our nation. I'm Judge Gerald Parker, along with
Dave Greer,
our legal historian, basically the iCloud of all things happening in the legal community of Dayton.
A lot of clouds between my ears, I guarantee you that.
You wish you would have had an iCloud when you started practicing?
No.
Yeah.
I wish we didn't have it when I'm in practice.
I can't wait for this episode. We're going to be talking about Herb Eikenbary, a figure, a comical figure, somebody who was also a great lawyer, of course, handled all types of cases, but a bit of a three-ring circus as it pertains to Herb Eikenbary. Tell us about Herb.
Well, I suppose I can sum up the entire morning's presentation by just a quote from Jim Fain when he was the editor of the Dayton Daily News. Mm-hmm. He said, to call Herb Eikenbary colorful was like calling a Rolls Royce transportation.
I like that.
And I think before we launch into the future in our discussion of Herb, maybe a little glance backward wouldn't hurt anybody. Yeah. If we look back at our discussions of the desegregation case and the Reichs-Bierman antitrust dispute, it seems to me in those discussions, we were looking at the law like it was a river flowing through society.
That's right.
And carrying with it hopes and ambiguities and ironies and controversies and change.
All right.
And then we moved to John McMahon, and the way I would describe that one is the law looking like a Gothic cathedral.
Right.
Stable, permanent, lasting forever, beautiful, harmony, art, you name it, a fine thing. Lawyers gathering there, some of them like bad lawyer jokes covered with pigeon droppings, but others who are truly subjects of awe and amazement.
That's true.
Now, going into this episode today, I think what we're looking at law as a giant mirror in which is reflected human nature, the whole human comedy, so we can sit back and relax and talk about the law as involving laughter and love.
That's awesome. That's going to be a lot of fun.
Now, Herb Eikenbary came into the practice of law in 1926. Merle Wilberding, who was the last president of the Dayton Bar Association, came to Dayton from a big Washington firm in the year 1973, which was 1 year before Herb's death in 1974. And if somebody wanted to grab a copy of the Bar Briefs magazine from November of 2021, there would be Merle's story of his introduction to Herb Eikenbary, which, coming from a big law firm, first thing he did when he came to Dayton was to attend the bar luncheon at which Eikenbary was giving one of his endless speeches. And he first thought he was lost in a recitation from Finnegan's Wake or something. This is totally bizarre. And so he was initially turned off, and then the more he thought about it, the more turned on he got, and the more fascinating he got with Herb as the years went by. That was a year before Herb's death. He died in 1974. Herb was an East End kid in Dayton. His father had been a sheriff in Preble County and then became the assistant superintendent of the Dayton State Hospital, also known in its day as the Insane Asylum, or with all due deference to Olivia de Havilland, as the Snake Pit. We only have one other lawyer in the history of Dayton who had a father who was involved with the Dayton State Hospital. And that lawyer came to Dayton in 1974, the same year, as fate would have it, that Herb Eikenbary died. His name was Charlie Faruqi.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And his daddy was one of the sweetest men who ever lived. I loved him because he got his studies at Tulane and New Orleans and loved old jazz. So there's Charlie, unlike Herb, was not funny and irreverent all the time.
Right.
When he was trying a case, he was an excellent business litigation type of guy. And when he was seriously trying a case, it was as serious as a heart attack. But he had this secret dream, I think, of always wanting to end up in life as a stand-up comedian. He's now retired, so maybe he'll have that chance for a new career. But our friend, Mr. Eikenbary, was a great athlete in his youth, surprisingly, because he doesn't strike you from his pictures as being an athlete at all.
Didn't he look like Winston Churchill or something like that?
Yeah, in fact, in his office, he had a big framed portrait of Winston Churchill with a big framed portrait of himself in an identical pose.
It's not weird at all.
Right next to it.
Not weird at all.
Not weird at all. It's what everybody would like to have. The best way to get to know Herb, I think, is to have various people tell you what he was like.
Yeah.
And we've got the good fortune of an oral history effort that the Bar Association's been doing for the last 10 years or so. So we've got a number of clips that'll put us together with Herb as he looked at different people. I had the joy of interacting with him for 22 years, the first 22 years of my practice. And I could add plenty to those clips, but those clips are more significant than anything I have to say. Let's start out with a guy who, in some respects, while he's the next generation, was another colorful guy, as colorful as Herb Eikenbary, my friend Danny O'Brien. Yeah. Good Irish guy. Herb Eikenbary's mother was born in Ireland, so he got some of that storytelling and stuff from his mother, I'm sure.
Yeah, let's hear from Danny O'Brien. It allows us to set the scene.
Okay.
Big bruiser of a guy, like a country bumpkin gentleman he tried to portray when he was smarter than hell. Everybody knew him. Everybody loved him. His reputation was that he did represent a lot of ladies of the night, which was a much bigger thing back in those days than it is today, because apparently there were a lot of ladies of the night. And Herb would go to would be their knight in shining armor and go plead their cases down at the Dayton Municipal Court and whatever. And his best friend would be a person that plays a big part in my life, and that is Mr. Jack Patrickoff. So Patrickoff and Eikenbary are very close friends. It is alleged that Mr. Eikenbary had a little home on Wayne Avenue, and that on Saturdays, nobody will believe it that's watching this tape, but on Saturdays we used to have motion practice, as you will recall. Banking, the banks were open, we do all our banking, and then have a lunch with the boys or whatever, but that Saturday was a working day.
Every lawyer in town would be in the courthouse on Saturday morning, and they'd hear all the motions orally that were filed that week.
Absolutely, and do your banking too. Remember that was the thing. You get straight with the bank, and you'll get all the money. You accumulate, get it into the bank, and then go and have a. That was a lunch day where you could have a beer. But Mr. Eikenbary allegedly had this house at Wayne Avenue where, after the events of Saturday morning, certain lawyers would gather, some of them allegedly married, and there would be ladies out there and men out there and ladies of the night out there and lawyers out there, some judges out there.
Plus a live lion in the basement.
That's exactly right, and a live lion in the basement. And when you pulled the cord in the bathroom, a voice would talk to you.
Well, what's your reaction to all of that, Gerald?
Let's just start off with the representation of the ladies of the night. I mean, I think that's something that'd be kind of fun to start with. I don't know.
Yeah, prostitution was perfectly legal in Dayton, Ohio until 1915, and there were a lot of beautiful bordellos. Pearl Street was the place where you would find them. It was a street that went on an angle from Wayne Avenue to 5th Street. Beautiful homes. And the queen of all of them was a gal named Lib Hedges, who is reputed to be the only person who ever knocked out John L. Sullivan, the great heavyweight boxer. He apparently uttered a profanity in her parlor, and she hit him over the head with a beer bottle and flattened him out. Wow. So, lovely lady. You'll find her grave in the Woodland
Wait, lovely lady?
Well, yeah, in fact, when she died, the newspapers, of course, came to Herb as her lawyer.
Okay.
The girls had given Herb a great big silver cup memorializing all the kindness he had expended on them. And the newspapers came to Herb and said, what kind of a woman was this? And Herb, who had never was at a loss for words, said, she was a wonderful woman. Many mourned her death, though few attended her funeral.
Oh, wow. Wow.
So, yeah, the ladies of the night had a good representation.
Can you tell us the story about? Let's go to the lion. Let's go to the lion story. I've been dying to get to this story because I just think it's fascinating, and I don't know any way that would happen here today.
Herb always claimed that his clientele was kind of interesting, the kind of people who like to go to the neighborhood tavern and have a beer for breakfast. The kind of people that he represented, he would describe as clothesline thieves and chicken rustlers. But he represents some other people as well. The lion in the basement, a roustabout for the Ringling Brothers Circus when they were in town, got in some sort of probably got drunk and cited into municipal court. And he had no money to pay Herb for representing him. So what he had, in those days, if somebody didn't have money, he ended up with a jar of tomato preserves or something to eat or whatever they had to give you.
What if the ladies of the night didn't have money? No,
Oh,
never
they
mind.
had
We'll keep it
plenty
moving.
money,
We'll keep it
plenty
moving.
of money.
Okay, I'm just asking for a friend.
Yeah, they ran a pretty good business. In fact, Lib was one of the big contributors to the Save the City Fund after the flood, although she cursed that they picked on her to get money.
Yeah. Get to the lion in the basement story.
Get to the lion.
in the
Okay, the lion in the basement. It's just a lion cub, just a little lion cub. The roustabout had it at the circus, and he gave it to Herb as his fee. Well, Herb accepted it graciously. Didn't know exactly what to do with it.
Yeah, I could only imagine.
Herb's establishment at the time, which is still there across the street from Belmont High School on Wayne Avenue, big ugly building, but it had in the back one of those trap, the door that you lift up that's kind of a horizontal door. So he put the cub in the basement, and not knowing what to do with it, as it grew older and became noisier, he would go to the Kroger's or the supermarket down the street and get the leftover beef and that sort of stuff. And he'd open that trap door and throw that stuff down in the basement, and you hear all this going on. Nobody knows what exactly happened to that lion. It was down there for quite a while. And that's like all these Herb stories. They don't sound like true stories,
Right?
but they are true stories.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's fantastic.
Now, the next piece we have with Danny. Danny was started out in the prosecutor's office when Paul Young was the prosecutor, between the long reign of Matt Heck Sr. And the long reign of Lee Falke, who was Paul Young had a one term as prosecutor, and Danny started his practice in that prosecutorial office.
Like many did.
I
started my legal career as a prosecuting attorney.
It's
So
a good place to start.
yeah, grind
Get
your
your
teeth
feet on
in
the
there.
ground.
Yep.
And of course, Danny was sure he was going to end up making Perry Mason look like Gomer Pyle. He was going to be the greatest prosecutorial zeal man that ever existed. Well, those old-time judges and lawyers, they kind of initiated the young ones. And the combination of Herb Eikenbary and Judge Thomas, who was a wonderful, wonderful judge, quite a character, was the head of the Thomas Players that put on the gridiron skits every year, grew up inside the walls of the Ohio State Penitentiary, where his father was the warden for decades, and his sister worked for his father at the penitentiary. In any event, Danny's going to tell you about what those two old men did to him when he was a young prosecutor.
Yeah, that's good stuff.
Quick story, I got to tell you this. He and Don Thomas, also Thomas Player, I've got the reputation of being a tough, ferocious young prosecutor. Nobody had taken me under their wing. I just saw it. I really believed this story. And so the criminal docket was backing up, and Thomas, I think, got together with Eikenbary, and they decided to send me over there to go work out all the cases that Eikenbary had, because the docket was getting behind.
This while you're defense?
I am a prosecutor.
Oh, this while you're on the prosecutor.
I'm a prosecutor. Thomas says, go over there. How many cases you got with Eikenbary? 8. He says, take some, leave some, dismiss some, reduce some, and get a plea to charge. That's how you do the deal. You got to dance around with him a little bit. He may take a half hour, 45 minutes before he's ready to talk. Just go along with the program. I will subsequently learn that he and Eikenbary had talked before I went over there, and I found out what the program was. And so I go over there. It's like 95 degrees. It's 9 o'clock one morning. I'm to meet Mr. Eikenbary. They show me in, and only the innocent enter these portals. Remember the big sign?
And he's got a big picture of Winston Churchill on the wall with an identical picture of himself in the same pose next to it.
And actually, you're bringing up a good point. He looked a lot like Winston Churchill, But anyway, I go in there, and he says, how about a drink? It's 9 a.m. How about a beer, Sonny? I said, no, it's a little too early for me. I said, I don't trust anybody who doesn't drink with me. I don't like to drink, alone. I like to drink with people, so I guess this is over. And he closes the book. And I said, oh, my God, Judge Thomas is going to kill me here. So, what the hell, one beer won't hurt. It's hotter than hell out there. 6 beers later, we had 7 dismissals of the 8 cases and 1 reduced. They got me drunk.
Bastille Day.
And I'm sure they had a big laugh over it. And here I am, 10:30, I'm gassed. Guy, after he seen me, I've had 8 beers. He said, now we're ready to talk, Sonny. What do you got?
Well, that's one way to get some plea deals.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. I don't know if I could let my attorneys do that. I mean, they might do that, outside of my courtroom, but, if they get some cases moving, I guess.
Well, they figured these guys are no more harm on the street than they are if you have them in the penitentiary. Who cares? They're going to end up one place or the other sooner or later anyway. And, when Herb ran for Dayton Municipal Court as a judge a number of times and was indeed tapped to be a visiting judge at the municipal court from time to time, which it was kind of a circus too, because they'd have all the gals from the Mayfair Burlesque would be there on Monday morning, plus the drunks that were there routinely every Monday morning. And when the word would get out that Herb was going to be the visiting judge at the Dayton Municipal Court, every lawyer in town came running to the court with the papers and their clients, because it was Bastille Day. And when Herb was the judge, there was a lot of people turned loose.
I bet. He was a pretty good storyteller, right?
Oh, he was beyond compare, yeah.
He went to Russia, but he didn't on one of his stories?
He went to 50 different countries in his lifetime. He loved to travel, and he loved to tell stories. In those days, there were lunch clubs of groups that met weekly in Dayton, all these various clubs, and they'd have people give speeches. Mm-hmm. And Herb would be at half of them all the time, giving a speech on one thing or another. We'll get to that part of it, but I think while we're still with Paul Young's office, there was another young lawyer who was quite a character in that prosecutor's office, along with Danny O'Brien. 1 year younger than Danny. and still 1 year younger than Danny, but still around. The other one, instead of turning out to be a criminal defense lawyer, turned out to be a revered federal judge right here in the city,
yeah.
Walter Rice.
Building named after Judge Walter Rice, an
Yeah.
icon.
Yeah, I don't know why. Herb had his little building was called the Lawyers Building. He didn't put his name on the wall, but Judge Rice has the wonderful thing of, as he says, that the nice thing about having your name on the wall of the courthouse is that if you get lost, you'll know where to find it.
That's right. That works. That's right.
But Walter was a kind of a cut-up when he was a young guy in the prosecutor's office with Danny, and we asked him for some of his recollections of his dealings with Herb, and let's listen to those.
Let's hear what Judge Walter Rice, federal Judge Walter Rice, has to say.
Well, I would say that prior to, no one was more memorable than Herb Eikenbary. We could take an hour in the repeating of Herb Eikenbary stories. I will simply indicate that I've read and heard a lot of them. None of them does him justice. He was a brilliant man. He was a character whose somewhat unusual personality hid the fact that he was an excellent, excellent attorney. The criminal defense attorneys were a unique breed, and my golly, I hope I can do justice to them. The most unique was Herb Eikenbary, who was totally irreverent, many times, whose arguments were totally irrelevant. And he had unique turns of phrases. He used to refer to me when I was in the prosecutor's office as Queen's Counsel. I remember once trying a case against him in Judge Robert Martin's court. This is 65, probably. Judge Martin had been a judge at that time for 30 years. His father before him was a judge for a good length of time. And I remember this one case, I was objecting and objecting and objecting, and I was overruled continuously. So in the middle of the trial, Herb walks up to me and whispers, "Don't get upset, Walter. He's not too bright. The only reason he gets elected is people think they're still voting for his father." Were you able to pick that up, Rob? Okay. And he used to file all sorts of motions, even after I became a judge, signing at the claw. I've got, if you have time after we're finished, a framed pleading of his in DR court, in which he was importuning the domestic relations judge to allow his client enough money to get a new set of false teeth.
Notably, and it probably wasn't in your court, but he had one murder case that he tried, I don't know whether it was with Jack or with somebody else, where the client ended up with a life sentence, and he was interviewed by the paper thereafter, and they asked him his comments on the trial. He says, "Well, I thought it went fairly well, and I think if I'd had another week, I could have gotten him in the chair."
Well, Walter Rice is, of course, a special human being to me. It's almost like a mentor and somebody I follow as well. And I can only imagine all the stories that he's had on top of what we just heard.
Well, the one he was referring to of the motion that Herb had filed in domestic relations court to get his enough money to buy a set of false teeth for his client. I used to have a copy of that motion, which was beautiful. It was essentially, Herb was representing a lady whose husband, as they were in a divorce situation, stole her false teeth. So he was dealing with a lady who just could mutter and make noises. And so he filed this motion saying, "I cannot communicate with my client. She's full of sound and fury, signifying nothing, and she makes just these guttural noises. So I need money. Either he brings back her false teeth or he gives us some money for some false teeth." So that was Herb's typical trip to domestic relations court.
What about the guitar story, though? That's a fantastic one.
Yeah, that's, in fact, the next one, let's listen to Charlie Shook. Charlie Shook was not a trial attorney. He ended up being a master of lean priorities and complex commercial matters. But everybody in their youth and in the old days got a taste of everything that there was in the Rialto. So here's Charlie in his old age telling about his encounter in domestic relations court with Herb Eikenbary.
Yeah, listen in.
And I somehow wound up trying what should have been the world's simplest non-contested divorce case with Herb Eikenbary, except that my client, the wife, had pawned her husband's guitar to buy a bus ticket to visit her family in Tennessee to get counseling as to whether she should remain married to her husband or whether they should get a divorce. And these people were economically not well off at all. In fact, the guitar may have been their most valuable possession. And the husband was happy to get rid of her and their little child, but he wanted his guitar back. And I kept telling Herb, we'd give it back if she had it, but she pawned it and it's gone, and she doesn't have the money to replace it. We wound up finally having a pre-trial conference. We tried the case. Judge Shearer said he would give us 5 minutes at the end of his docket of non-cons on some day, and would we please use the short form? So I put my client on the stand, and that took about 1.5 minutes. And Herb put his client on the stand and asked him if he played his guitar very often. And his client, I was wondering, what in the world? Where is this going? And his client, oh, yes, Mr. Eikenbary, every night when I came home from work. Well, did you ever sing when you played your guitar? Well, yes, Mr. Eikenbary, sometimes I did. Did you ever think that might be why your wife left you?
That's a great story.
As a guitar player, it touches my heart.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, in those days in domestic relations court, if you had even a non-contested divorce, you had to bring 2 witnesses to court to establish that the other party was guilty of gross neglect of duty or extreme cruelty, and to establish your reputation. And it got to be just a kind of a routine that lasted about 2 seconds, except when Herb was representing the plaintiff. And then he would ask questions of one witness like, well, what is Alice's reputation among all those peons down in the trash alley? What do they think of her? Or the extreme cruelty, it would be, well, now, we got to have something good here. It's not just cruelty that's aground. It's extreme cruelty. We want some extreme cruelty here.
Right.
Or not just a neglect of duty, but gross neglect of duty. So you make sure you...
Words that are added to, in legal terms, that we still don't understand why it's even added to it.
But there it is.
Yeah.
So the judge would go nuts because Herb would take up time that he didn't need to take up. And he estimated that in his lifetime in the domestic relations court, he had upwards of 2,000 divorces that he handled.
Wow.
That's a lot of domestic intranquility.
Right. Imagine how much he'd be killing it today.
Part of what Herb did when he wasn't in his office or in the courthouse was travel. He loved to travel, and in his lifetime, he claims he was in 50 different countries. The article that was in the bar briefs has a picture of him on this 3-wheeled motorcycle, which was taken when he did a 6-week tour of the British Isles, flying around on this three-wheeled motorcycle. He would tend to elaborate a little bit on the travelogues that he would give. And Dick Scher, who is an interesting attorney in town, can tell you a little bit about his experience as a young man with Herb's travels.
Yeah, let's hear from Dick.
As a junior in high school, I belonged to a fraternity that met over here at Christ Episcopal Church. And they had members that were from Steele and Oakwood. And I was a member. I was a person who was supposed to go out and get people to come talk to us. I told Dad, I said, I'm running out of people. I don't know. Why don't you call Herb Eikenbary and see if he'll come over and talk on something? He said, it doesn't take him much to get going. So I called him. Mr. Eikenbary, I belonged to Tau Beta, which is the name of the fraternity, and I said, we need somebody to talk to us about either the law or some of your travels. I know you've traveled extensively. He says, I'll tell you what I can do. He says, you tell me when, and I'll be there, and my theme will be Russia. He said, I just got back from over there. He shows up, and he goes over this in his own inimitable comedic way of going through all of the history of Russia, including his particular things that he talked about, St. Petersburg, Moscow, and all these different things. And they had these guys, they were on the floor laughing so much at him. And not at him, with him. And final phraseology of the speech, which lasted maybe no more than a half an hour, maybe 20 minutes, I don't know. He says, I have one thing I have got to let you know. He said, all this was accumulated as I flew over Russia. He'd never been on the ground in Russia.
Herb's stories of his travels were only matched by his stories of Dayton history. He was the head of the Dayton Historical Society for a while. And there's a story of his being called out to Centerville when Centerville had a very small number of people to give the history of Centerville, Ohio. And he gave this just hair-raising story of wolves screaming at night and Indians scalping settlers, and it just went on and on. It was better than any Western movie I ever saw, all of which was just made up on the spot time. So
sounds like Twitter.
That's
like Twitter, pretty much, right?
We've talked a little bit about his the center of his circus, which was his office downtown. But there are plenty of lawyers who observed all of that in place, one of whom was Cheryl Roberts. And maybe we'll let Cheryl tell you a little bit about what it was.
He had this old statue of some sort of an owl that he had outside of his front door, and he had it chained, and he had a big sign to it that beware that this was a relic of some civilization, and that if anyone dared steal that they would have the curse of the pharaohs on them. And I enjoyed him so thoroughly. In fact, I look forward to going over to the Dayton sales office just to talk with Old Gridiron, which was the traditional social event of the Bar Association, would start off with the segment known as Herb's Bar. And Herb would play the part of a bartender and stand behind the bar, and then various members of the bar would come in as patrons of this bar, and he would throw out lines. What happened to this? What happened to that? You know, and it was hilarious. You really didn't have. He did not have a script. Everybody else had a script, but he would just ad-lib it, and no two versions were ever the same.
We got a few more observations of Herb before we just start kicking around between the two of us. Mm-hmm. Another observation of him, both as to his environs and as to his habits, was Judge Foley. really nice, another Irish guy. But let's hear what his little cameo on Herb Eikenbary turns out to be.
Shaking my head.
You remember when somebody stole the owl from his porch?
No.
He had his office was at I think Wilkinson and Monument, maybe, or First Street. It was an old house, and he had a ceramic owl sitting on the front, trying to represent that he himself was as wise as an owl, probably, and he was as wise as an owl. But somebody stole that owl, and Herb made the biggest stink about that he possibly could. He put a reward ad in the paper for this $2.95 owl, and he wrote letters to the Bar Association saying, if you guys represent anybody that stole an owl, I want to know about it right now. But the case I tried with him was in the municipal court. During the course of one of the witnesses' testimony, he mentioned some kind of a tavern out on the east side of Dayton. And the judge looked at Herb, and Herb looked at the judge, and they smiled at each other, and they started laughing. And for the next 45 minutes, I'm not going to tell you who the judge was, but Herb and that judge must have spent a lot of time in that tavern, because they had about 25 stories back and forth as the funny things that happened to them, trouble they almost got into at this bar. Everybody forgot about the case. I don't know how the case came out anymore, but I remember my client a couple days later saying, I know you passed a bar one time, but I think maybe from here on, after you get done working at the end of the day, you ought to go out to that bar on the East End. You might meet some influential people out there.
Bill Cromer was another character, and here's a couple of little niblets from him about our friend Herb.
The great comedian of the bar, which we will never know one like him, was Herbert Eikenbary. I don't know any of your other people have mentioned, but I knew Herb real well, and he died in September of 1974 during my term of office as the president of the bar. And so in November, we had a program in which older lawyers were each allowed 5 minutes to reminisce about Herb, the humorous thing that he did. I know you remember him too.
Oh, yes.
And the ones that I told were the fact that your desk gets piled up with pieces of paper, old notes, phone calls, notices of all little scraps of paper so what Herb would, when it get all piled up, he'd put it all in a envelope, mailed it to Lloyd O'Hara, everything all. Behind his desk, he had an official document, which you would assume was his certificate from the Supreme Court to practice law. And there it was, and for a long time. So finally somebody looked at it. It was his vacuum sweeper warranty. That's what he did. Nobody looks at these things anyway. That's as good as anything. Did you ever hear that? He had his vacuum sweeper warranty behind his desk.
That's wonderful.
The reference to Lloyd O'Hara, do you remember Lloyd O'Hara? He was the rainmaker at Smith & Schnocky, the big firm in town, and was the king of the divorce court. So Herb sending all of his clippings over to Lloyd O'Hara was just a little irritation. Likewise, that warranty for his washing machine on the wall of his office was a little nod to all the lawyers that like to have their office walls covered with diplomas and certificates of their sanity and that sort of thing.
So what about this, the Los Angeles motel story?
Yeah, I had two cases with Herb, and I spent a lot of time with him on the old gridiron shows. One was a baggy pants comedian from the Mayfair Burlesque who had a little run-in on the west side of Dayton on his way to the next show in Indianapolis.
Right.
The Los Angeles story, we had a long deposition of this guy in Herb's office. It was a country gentleman who had never really been out of Kentucky or eastern Ohio. And he decided he wanted to go to Los Angeles and take his wife and his kids. So they get in their old beat-up old car and drive without stopping from Dayton to Los Angeles, California.
With kids? Sounds terrible.
With two kids. And they stop at this cheap motel outside of Los Angeles. And they've got a downstairs room that's got a back room where the kids can sleep and a front room where the husband and wife can sleep. And they're just exhausted from this long ride, and they collapse into their respective beds. And all of a sudden, there's all this noise going on, and screaming and singing and bottles clanking, and they're having this gigantic party upstairs. And cars keep showing up and people running upstairs and joining this thing, and all sorts of wild things are going on. And finally, the couple manages to doze off to sleep, and the next thing they know, there's suddenly these bright lights in their eyes. And the kids are all rattling around in the next room. And apparently a late comer to the party had driven his car through the wall and hit their bed and knocked it into the other wall and knocked the kids out of their beds in the next room. And so Herb was filing a suit against the chain of motels that owned this cheap motel, claiming that they were running a bawdy house out there in Los Angeles. Case absolutely went nowhere, but it was a wonderful afternoon, and it was a typical Herb Eikenbary case.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely.
He had a lot of cases, tried some serious cases.
Yeah, he didn't just handle like some of these funny ones, and some of these, these cases were all over the place, right?
Yeah, he had a capital murder case once where the jury came in and gave his client a conviction on the lesser included manslaughter charge, and the newspaper asked her, "Well, what'd you think of that?" And he said, "I think if they give me another couple of days, I could have gotten him in the chair." Let's talk a little bit about him as a human being, because he was that, a very human being, a man with a big heart.
Yeah.
My favorite Herb Eikenbary story is the story of the lady who came into his office in tears, just sobbing. And he tried to find out what her problem was, and she finally blurted out that Charlie was gone. Well, he figured that somebody had kidnapped her husband or something like that. And he probed a little more and found out that Charlie was her pet chicken. Why you would name a chicken Charlie, because it's the different gender, I don't know.
I don't know what you name chickens, to be honest with you. I don't know what.
She had this chicken, and the chicken was gone, and she didn't know what to do. She said, "Madam, you have come to the right place. I'm a specialist in finding lost chickens." He would do that all the time. Somebody stopped him in the courthouse once and said, Mr. Eikenbary, the city of Dayton hasn't picked up my garbage for 3 weeks." And he said, "I'm so glad you found me. I've been studying that branch of the law, and I can tell you that if they don't pick up your garbage, you are within your legal rights to keep it." So he had the same thing with Charlie the chicken. He said, "I'll tell you what, if you come back here at this time, give me $10.
Mm-hmm.
And you come back here this time tomorrow, and Charlie will be here." So she came back the next day, still kind of sniffling, and she looks up, and there is a chicken in his office. A lot of feathers are missing, and the chicken's kind of walking in figure eights. And says, "No." She looks at it and says, "That's not Charlie." And he said, "Oh, yes, it is, but you have no idea what that chicken has been through since it left your home." And he gave her a story for half an hour that's rivaled the Odyssey, and everything that happened to the chicken. She became a happy client. She grabbed that chicken to her breast and went out, and Herb had made $9.90 out of that $10. And he spent the other 10 cents to get a chicken at Frank's Poultry on his way into work that morning.
Oh my gosh, it sounds like a '90s sitcom where like
he did other things that were truly kind.
Mm-hmm.
He had a secretary who developed tuberculosis and was in a hospital for tubercular people for months on end. And every week he sent her paycheck as if she was still in the office. He had a cleaning lady who he'd sit around at night and talk with the cleaning lady, and she wanted to become a nurse. So he paid and got her through nursing school, and she became a nurse. He had a 12-year-old paper boy who delivered the paper to his office. And he asked the boy what he really wanted to do in life. You don't deliver papers your whole life, do you? Well, the boy ended up Herb sent him to law school, through college to law school, and the boy became a municipal judge in Kettering, Ohio.
Oh, really?
So all those things went on, and when Herb died, he had left a will that left all of his money to the Dayton Bar Association to make loans to young lawyers who need money to try to get their feet on the ground and get into the practice of law.
That's the Eikenbary Trust, right?
Yeah, that's why everybody still sees Herb's picture in the Dayton Bar briefs on a monthly basis and say, who is that guy?
Yeah, that's just the little things that people don't realize, especially young attorneys are trying to figure this whole, what do I use to start this practice, and how do I start this whole thing? Do I spend money here with supplies? Do I need a building, advertisement? But those little things outside of the courtroom are important, and I feel like just understanding and hearing about Herb, it's like the things that he did outside of the courtroom are just as important as the things he did inside.
Yeah, and the beautiful thing about the man is there's a lot of funny stuff.
Right.
But the beautiful thing about him is he had a big heart, and he was a good person.
Yeah.
And being a good person is probably better than being a great lawyer, if the truth were known.
And he was who he was, right? Some attorneys want to be somebody they're not or what they see on TV, but Herb was who he was, and his character just shined through.
And we haven't touched on all the things that he did. They had Herb's bar every year at the Gridiron Show, and Will Rogers said he never met a man he didn't like, and Herb was kind of like that. But he's also never met a human being that didn't like him.
Yeah. So I seem to think that I've heard the stories of older, seasoned attorneys that come into my courtroom, and they tell these stories similar to what we've heard today that I'm like, that would not happen today. And the stories are fascinating. It makes you want to be in that time just to see how you manage through that time period. And then now it's almost as if we're a little bit more straight-laced, a little bit more disciplinary. The rules are a lot more tightened, would you say?
Yeah, we didn't have much in the way, if you stole money from somebody or if you committed a felony, you could lose your license.
Yeah.
But it was hard to get into ethical problems.
It was hard to get into ethical problems.
And you had a freedom that you don't have anymore. And it's kind of a 180 switch. In the old days, when they tried cases, they were rough with each other.
Right.
And they'd rough on witnesses and every once in a while somebody get punched in the courtroom.
Yeah.
And as soon as court was over, they were off to a bar having a beer together.
That's what I was going to bring up.
It was one big happy family, fighting with the same people all the time. And now we're just the opposite.
Yeah, I mean,
everybody's a gentleman or a polite lady in the courtroom, and then afterwards they're ready to cut each other's throats.
Right. I just had a trial finish up this past week, and after that verdict came, they went their separate ways. But all the stories I hear from the folks before me, during recesses and during the end of the trial, they're across the street having a beer and just having a good time for the whole weekend, enjoying it.
Judge Weinman had a great story when he was a rough trial lawyer over in Steubenville, Ohio, where he grew up. He trying a case where the two clients just hated each other. I mean, they really would rather have killed each other than have to go through the procedure of a court thing. They try the case, the jury goes out, the two lawyers go over to the bar across the street and manage to drink up a bunch of whiskey until it's time for the jury to come in and give the verdict. When they come back, Weinman's client is just madder than a wet hen. How could you consort with that guy who was representing the man I hate? And Judge Weinman told him, well, you remember when I told you what my fee charge was going to be, and you weren't too happy about that. No, I wasn't, but I paid it. And he said, that was my charge as a fee for my professional services. I didn't tell you about what my fee is if you want me to change my personal life.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's true. Time, that's what you're paying for, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Bugs Moran, right? Bugs Moran, I'm assuming, well, you tell me who Bugs Moran was.
Well, everybody knows about the Valentine's Day massacre where Al Capone got the Dayton boys and the St. Louis boys to come up to Chicago to blow away the rival mob that was run by Bugs Moran.
I mean, if your name is Bugs Moran, you have to be a mobster, right? There's nothing else you can do other than, you know what I mean? That's what you're going to be.
Well, he was big-time gangster in Chicago and ran the North End while Capone was running the South End. And he got caught up in Dayton and a trial that took place back in the, 46 or something like that. In those days, when you had a big trial like that, everybody showed up. I mean, there was no radio, there was no TV to get in the way. So it was quite a community event. Albert Scher represented Bugs Moran in that case.
Wow.
And Herb Eikenbary represented his co-defendant, a guy named Al Fouts, who's quite a character too.
What were they doing in Dayton?
They were knocking off a guy that was getting a bunch of money from the Winters Bank on the west side to take to his bar to pay the guys at General Motors. You know, the bars in those days, you'd cash your check at your neighborhood bar when you got off work on Friday afternoon, and you didn't have to take your paycheck home to your wife.
Oh, gosh.
And so they would have big pile of cash in those bars.
All right.
And so they grabbed this guy on the way and stole his money. Funny stories out of that case and some really interesting stuff we don't have time to go into. But at any rate, Bugs Moran and Al end up with 10 years in the Ohio State Penitentiary. And on the way back, they pick up a bank robbery charge and end up with another 5 years in Leavenworth. Bugs Moran dies in Leavenworth. Fouts serves his 5 years there, so he's now spent the last 15 years in the penitentiary, and before that he'd spent most of his life in every penitentiary you can dream of in the country.
Wow.
But there's a wonderful letter that Herb wrote to him after he got a Christmas card from him after he got out. It's too long to read that one, but let me give you a little sample of Herb's prose style.
Yeah.
Gary Gottschalk, a fine attorney in Dayton, sent some resumes to Dayton lawyers when he got out of Notre Dame Law School, thinking he could find himself a job in Dayton. One of the people that got one of those resumes turned out to be Herb Eikenbary. Gary had no idea who in the world he was.
Right.
So Herb wrote a letter back, and we'll kind of end our little ceremony today with a sample of Herb's prose style.
Yeah.
This is the letter he wrote in response to this application for a job. Your biographical resume is most comprehensive and illuminating, and speaks your qualifications, past and present. However, I must tell you that my professional realm is that of somewhat free and easy practice, representing people exclusively disturbed and undisturbed. I must confess that for 46 years, I have lived in a legalistic demimonde, representing bank robbers, safecrackers, women of easy and uneasy virtue, petty gamblers, panderers, procurers, clotheslines, thieves, pickpockets, and miscreants, large and small, of every vintage and degree, including the halt, the lame, and the blind, all whom are at outs with themselves, their God, their country, and their fellow men. And truly, my daily grist and grind is not as exemplary compared to a prestigious corporate practice, yet we do here try to serve the vicissitudes and aberrations of the body politic, including the great unwashed and unbaptized. Now, despite his somewhat modest self-evaluation, We are confident that Herb is still traveling the cosmos on his motorcycle and smoothing the rough edges of the law with laughter and love. He persuaded Gary that maybe this wasn't the job he wanted to have.
Gosh. Couldn't have just said we're not hiring, right? That's all I need to say, right? You can read more about Herb Eikenbary in Dave's book, Slough of History's Boot Soles. I got it right this time.
Oh, wow.
I know, how about that? Be sure to subscribe. We're having a lot of fun here learning about Dayton legal history. The Dayton Bar Association and Dayton Bar Foundation, this project has been funded in part by Dayton Legal Foundation, Dayton Legal Heritage Foundation of the Dayton Foundation, as well as the Eichelberger Foundation of Dayton Foundation. So we thank them for their support. Dave, anything else you want to say?
Or if you got some supplementation of these stories, there's an endless amount of them. We could probably have a 3-day podcast on Herb.
On our next episode of Retrial Podcast, Moses Jones. Who was he? Well, he was the first black attorney in Dayton. Looking forward to that episode. Let's do it. This is a 6-episode pilot podcast, and with your support, we can find funding for future episodes. Support us by subscribing, leaving a review, and comment.